Hi, everyone, and welcome to this session of the 9th Annual San Antonio Book Festival. I'm thrilled, as many of you are, rather, to see SABF return this spring online. My name is Matt Patin, the literary director of the Texas Book Festival, a cousin of sorts of SABF, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with Betina González, author of novel American Delirium, and Roberto Ontiveros, author of short story collection The Fight for Space. Betina isn't with us at the moment, but we're trying to get her online, so she might pop in. You might see her soon. But before we jump in, I'd like to first say that we hope you'll consider purchasing Betina and Roberto's books from Nowhere Bookshop, the book festival's bookseller. Independent bookstores have had a hard time during this pandemic, so we hope you'll support them, these writers, and the festival by purchasing their amazing books. Just click the Buy the Book button on the festival site. We also want to encourage you to ask questions. You'll see a Q&A box right there on your screen to the right, I believe, if you're on a desktop. There's a chat box and a Q&A box. So if there's a Q&A, so if you move over to the Q&A box, you can put your questions there. Toward the end of the conversation, we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. This afternoon's conversation will last 30 to 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions at that time. We've got 60 minutes, so we've got plenty of time to get to as many questions as we need to, but no need to wait with the questions. Please type those into the Q&A box whenever you'd like, and a producer will send them my way. Without further ado, so I'll introduce Roberto first, and if Betina can make it today, then I'll introduce Betina as well. But well, how about this? How about I go ahead and insert Betina first? So Betina González is the best-selling author of several novels and short story collections, for which she has won several awards. Betina earned her MFA in bilingual creative writing at the University of Texas, El Paso, and her PhD from the University of Pittsburgh. She lives in Buenos Aires and teaches at the University of Buenos Aires and New York University of Buenos Aires. American Delirium is Betina's first book to be published in English, and it has at least 3-star reviews by my last count. Author Julia Herrera calls American Delirium a beautiful and ruthless novel that asks readers to dive into it with their whole selves, to see themselves in its violence and its flickers of hope. Publishers Weekly says the book has, quote, the makings of a zany psychedelic romp, but instead the delirium is marvelously controlled. Gonzalez's distorted utopian vision is a memorable trip. Roberto Ontiveros, born in McAllen, is an artist, critic, and fiction writer. Some of his work has appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle, the Texas Observer, the Dallas Morning News, and the Believer. The Fight for Space is an exploration of the modes of art and obsession with 11 stories that run from fabulous comedy to surrealist noir. The tales, focusing on the inner lives of adult caregivers, delivery drivers, and painters, trace how the ubiquity of media, the world of sitcoms, talk radio, and superhero comics comes to flood the working class with a dreamlike dread. And I love that term, dreamlike dread, because it applies to both Betina and Roberto's work. So Roberto, thank you for joining us. And, you know, we're settling in here. I hope Betina joins us as well. I mean, I know in this virtual world, you know, everybody has technical difficulties, so we're trying our best here. But in my experience, these conversations are over before we know it. So I'd love to jump right in. And Roberto, if you'd like to read an excerpt from your book, and then we can take it from there.
Sure. Thank you so much, Matt. And thanks so much for putting this together with the questions you posed. I actually think that sometimes I don't write these things knowing what the hell I'm doing. And whenever somebody comes back at me with especially the Silver Age kind of question, I'm like, oh, now I kind of know. You know, couple decades later. So I'm going to read from the titular story, and I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to read a couple of pages from The Fight for Space. It was published like in 2005, and I kind of thought Batman was sort of like done even then, but I don't think it's ever going to be done. So there's some Batman references in there, and let me get started on that. The Fight for Space. I am starting to hate Batman. All the revenge and the blood and the vigilantism he gets away with, the luxury of his guilt and the costume that expresses his staid vendetta. Batman gets laid too, Catwoman, Batgirl, the daughters of his enemies. Plus, no matter what, Batman is at core a schizophrenic do-gooder, potentially as dangerous as the forces he aims to thwart. No matter what, Batman is still Bruce Wayne, billionaire, philanthropist, sack of shit crybaby, with the mansion and the butler doting after him. There's a girl at my work who doesn't take care of her kids. I mean, she takes basic food and shelter care, and they go to church and carnivals and get Happy Meals. But they don't call her mommy, they call her June. And June likes to say that she's more of a big sister than a mommy. June has 2 pretty little girls, both of them always drawing pictures of cars and balloons. smiling and trying to impress everyone in the office, age 7 and 5, and June is 23. June's mom knew the boss, cashed in a shadowy favor, and got him to hire her teenage daughter when the young woman needed to have work and immediate structure right after she got pregnant the first time and quit high school. June gets paid well too, like manager money. And I guess she does her work and customers like her. She even came out in the commercial we did for the Spanish channel. Everyone who sees her thinks June is a blonde-haired woman because she bleaches her hair. And the commercial was shot in a frosted light. June comes to work early and talks to the car insurance sales girl next door. When her kids are sick or not in school, she brings them in for the day. June's kids smile and never say anything. Everyone thinks they're beautiful, and they are. Batman's trophy room pisses me off the most. It's like our hero does not want to find peace. There's a dinosaur in that room, and costumes of every psycho nut job he ever caught. There's an oversized Joker card, a gigantic penny, and a glass display of all the Robin outfits. How do you meditate or get clear in a cave like that, with a wall-sized computer screen and bloody capes hanging off swivel chairs? June's husband manages a Chinese restaurant. I've never seen him, but I've heard her talk with the guy. She's smoking a cigarette and leaning against the white pickup he lets her drive, holding a cell phone to her ear as I pulled the dolly steeped with the clock radios and toasters into the back of the store. You don't support me, Vic. The rest of the day, June was silent. Most of the time, June's kids are around. She shouldn't have. Most of the kids. Oh boy, move. I think I kind of screwed up on that one. The rest of the day, June was silent. Most of the time, June says the kids shouldn't have been brought in. I'm kind of flipping out on this part right here for no reason. Let me get back to this one. Her man was a loser, wants to do nothing but hang out with her uncles and tell jokes, listen to cumias, and go to cantinas. Vic isn't a drinker, and he is never drunk. But the kind of fun he has when he is out with Jaime and Frank is something June can never offer him. Every time, no matter where you see any legitimate Batman merchandise, you see the words created by Bob Kane somewhere on it. Bob Kane was kind of the creator, and for sure the man who got paid. There's another man named Bill Finger, a shoe salesman Bob Kane knew from high school. When the superhero character Kane was trying to pitch wasn't going so well, Bill Finger stepped in with the ideas that informed the first salable sketch work for The Dark Knight. The notion that the Batman should look more like an actual bat, don a cape, have slits for eyes, and be a darker creature altogether. Bob Kane's original Batman looked kind of like Zorro with a Da Vinci flying machine strapped to his shoulders. Bill Finger wrote the first published Batman story and came up with the most of Catwoman, Two-Face the Riddler, the look of the Joker, and the Batcave itself. Bill Finger never got any real credit and was always kissing up to Bob Kane, even as he sharpened his boss's rough work and offered the comic book world some of its creepier, more endearing plot twists. At the end, Bill Finger could no longer be trusted to turn in assignments on time and died an alcoholic wreck. Ask anyone with a casual interest in the world's greatest detectives, and the chances are the fan won't know Bill Finger. I only know about him because of a tiny article in a comic book fanzine. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop it at that one. And the structure of this thing, what basically goes on here is that you get like a lot of Batman criticism. You get some like work resentment mixed in with like character June, and then the main character comes across a guy that looks like this. And somebody walking around, before we all wore masks, there's a guy walking around town who's just wearing a gas mask. And my main narrator kind of guy is getting nervous that the town might kind of go after him because he just looks really out of place. So that's kind of what's going on in that story. And the other thing I'm happy to say about it is that when I wrote this originally, that Bill Finger guy really wasn't talked about. But now if you do look at the Batman merchandise, you will see Bill Finger's name, because I think a lot of people started making a big deal about that after a while, or it got to be known. I guess it was published in maybe Wizard magazine, and then there was a documentary. So, well, good for his whoever can profit from that, I guess. So anyway. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you. And yeah, no, I think as far as the structure, I mean, it is somewhat, you say you were stumbling over it. I think you did just fine. But I mean, there is like a structure of the reading of this where it's kind of interspersing kind of this background of Batman with, the story itself. And so the way it's structured is I can see that. I personally too, I mean, I've long been a Batman fan. I was a Wizard subscriber for many years as well in the 90s, and I remember reading this story as well about Bob Kane, and I feel in so many ways it's kind of typical in a sense of someone gets all the credit. It's the McDonald's story. It's a lot of different stories of brands, like someone gets all the credit and someone is forgotten, for sure. But no, I definitely love the story. And Roberto, I wanted to ask you too about, I read in an article, and I believe it was San Antonio Magazine, that well, first of all, I should say for the audience that this is a collection of stories that have been written, and correct me if I'm wrong, Roberto, but more or less over 15 years. I mean, starting with the early aughts and then up to at least 2016, 2017. And I read in, I believe it was San Antonio Magazine, that the events of 9/11 have suffused the stories here throughout. It's not necessarily a theme of the stories, but it does help inform the atmosphere of them. The event of 9/11, I don't believe, is mentioned explicitly at all in any of the stories, but could you talk a little bit about that influence and how you feel it permeates the atmosphere of all the stories and A Fight for Space?
Sure. Well, when I was working on these originally, I was sort of finishing up on a book that has been something I've kind of been messing with forever, called, well, I keep changing the name, but for a while it was called Hate Pages, and for a while it was called Pantegral Nights, and I don't know what it's going to be called whenever they find it after I'm dead or whatever. But I was working on this thing, and I was pretty much at the end of it, and I was in a hotel room in the Valley where I am right now, and the first plane hit, September 11th, right? And I was pretty much on the last chapter. There was a wedding scene. First plane hit, I didn't even stop. I kind of looked up and I just went back. Second plane hit, I put it back, and I just wasn't going to work on it anymore. I didn't know how much that was going to affect it. I really just stopped at that point. I kind of quit, and I even challenged myself to not work on anything that was remotely absurdist for a while. I know there's this collection kind of crept back into it. But the first story I wrote after that was maybe the second story in the collection, Phoenix Framing, which was my attempt at just sort of a legitimate Bukowski-looking Raymond Carver thing, and it's filled with George Lucas references and like Fantastic Planet. But it was me just trying to write like normal, like maybe kind of daydreaming about pre-9/11 in a way. And it was really kind of a safe place to be in a way to work on that. So it actually kind of informed how I was going to write. Most of the stories are tangential in how they deal with the topic of 9/11. Like, no one's talking about any major problem that's going on. There's a story in there called Ruby Coast, which I don't think is necessarily, I don't think it looks like a surrealist piece, but it is curiously the one that is more connected to dreams than probably all of them. So I did have a dream around a little bit before all that with Rush Limbaugh as a character. And it wasn't like Rush Limbaugh the way we know him. It was Rush Limbaugh as a 35-year-old guy, kind of just not doing too well, like on just talking to somebody. And I guess, might as well have been me talking to him. And I kind of had a lot of sympathy in the dream for what was going on with this guy, And so I just sort of went with that. And I immediately started this story not in line, like behind a bunch of cars, because there was like a funeral procession. It was a little bit after like Bush's war, and I just had it in my head that it had to be. There was just so many like military things going on at that time, and during this one procession in particular, I figured it had to be like a fallen soldier, and those kind of things just came together, and I just wrote that piece. And it has nothing. If you read it, there's nothing to do with 9/11, but to me, that thing is so completely tied to all of that. That even the difficulty that the character Pincer Selby, who walks around with a gas mask, might encounter is based on the fear that the narrator has that the whole town is going to start turning on anybody that looks suspicious. So there's a lot of that, a lot of paranoia happening, and a lot of characters that are just daydreaming by watching a lot of TV or just listening to talk radio and maybe feeling part of something that isn't necessarily their life at all, but it's something supposed to placate them. So I think that might be one of the ways that happened there.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Oh no, please.
It did definitely put like these stories that are sort of, they ended up becoming more like the kind of stuff that I like to read and write anyway, but they did start off with a serious intention to just look like regular, kind of like, okay, this is what they wanted in the MFA program that I never finished. Okay, like this, right? So that's how that's how they started off. You know, it didn't take like two before I went right back into Rob's Bill or whatever.
Yeah, no, in Ruby Coast, I mean, totally got the Rush Limbaugh vibes, and I've always wondered too, and I think many have, is just, how much does or did Rush Limbaugh believe what he was saying, and how much of it was a character, for show. I was always interested in that. There was another story where there was kind of a Dr. Laura type character too, that I
Yeah,
that I
Dr.
enjoyed
Holly,
reading.
right? Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Somebody, I was hanging out with a I don't know how. Sometimes I'll just hang out with random people, right? And I ran into some guy that I didn't know. We spent the whole morning in San Marcos, talking, and he said, "Hey, I got a story in this collection here," and I pulled it out. It was They Let Me Drive, the one you're talking about. And he read it, and he was like, "Who's this Dr. Holly?" And I was like, "Well, Dr. Laura." He's like, "Ah, it's Dr. Laura." Yeah, so I guess, there's a reason why sometimes you want to go towards those popular culture things, just to make it like an easy parlance or something. But this, I guess the other guy was supposed to be Bill O'Reilly. I'm not sure. I don't know. When I first wrote these, my mom wanted me to do one about those car guys that were on NPR. Can you do one about the car guys on NPR? I'm like, I don't. So.
Yeah. And you mentioned something about how writing certain stories with certain settings that felt a bit pre 9/11, and I got that sense too with some of the story. I mean, there's so many things that feel, I think, from a 2021 perspective, kind of like Ludditism, because like postcards, for instance, sending yourself postcards like one of your characters does, putting them up on the wall. It felt very low tech in a very refreshing way, regardless of what era. Yeah, there you go. You were channeling
cleaning up too. They're going to fall out.
Yeah, channeling a bit of yourself there, but I mean, it did feel refreshingly pre, cell phones, pre-internet, that sort of thing, for sure. So I wanted to ask a little bit. So, I mean, one of the words in the name of this very panel is surreal. So I wanted to ask you I don't know, I don't want to get too academic about it, but kind of what your definition of surreal is, and how you would describe to readers who haven't read your book yet, like what makes this story collection surreal and what doesn't. I mean, I was looking at just the Merriam-Webster definition of surreal just recently, and it doesn't quite capture, I think, what
No, it won't capture it either, because for one thing, there's a huge situation that's been going on since the inception of surrealism, which is sort of this fight between commercial and sort of the whatever the Freudian part of it that's supposed to be. But we don't want to get academic. I guess I'll drop that real quick. What I come to realize that it is, for me, is a sort of stance that is somehow the marriage of surprise with fatalism. If you see that in a story, that's a good way to know that that's the feeling that is being expressed. Like, for instance, Kafka's The Bucket Rider is a very surreal kind of story. The guy inevitably sort of just goes off to his doom after he can't find some coal or something, right? If you read it real fast, you feel like you're watching a Tex Avery cartoon or something. And in a way, kind of more surreal in that element than like Andre Breton's like Nausea, which could all be explained away because the girl he's talking about seems to be bipolar or something. So you could almost just say that, oh, she's just got a problem. When the story is acting as if the incongruent is just, well, it had to be, then that's already like you're halfway there. The other part of it would be like if you start to have the character or the narrator try to figure out why this is happening, you're kind of already becoming like some kind of mystery now, and it's not. If it's just a matter of fact that it's going on, that's probably closer to what it is, And there have been a lot of it. Well, there have been a couple of like genuine attempts at surreal novels, and mostly they don't follow through. They'll start to they'll just get eccentrics in there. You put a bunch of eccentrics together, and that's fine. But a truly surreal, I was thinking, I brought up Raymond Carver. He's not really a favorite guy of mine. I don't really like to read Raymond Carver, but I used to have to defend why I didn't like to read him so much. And I had this old idea about him that I started thinking about today. So I was looking at Bernard Malamud, Natural, right? I have avoided that book forever because I'm just not interested in baseball, right? But I like Malamud, so I read it. I love this book. It's like, to me, that's a surreal novel, the way it's written, An early Carver, before he was really influenced by I guess who's his editor at Esquire, that Lish or something. that guy seems to have really affected how he wrote his stories, or at least edited them like into something that looks like how we all know, sort of like this deadpan thing. But prior to that, for at least a good 5 or 6 years, it seemed like he was just writing nutty. It was the same situations going on, but not a lot of explanation for why it was happening. So it just did look like a surreal nightmare. So I would say that like maybe the kind of reliance upon the audience to just not be unnerved, even though it's supposed to be technically unnerving. As far as surrealism goes, getting into it in our lives, I think I probably first saw Dolly on a Bugs Bunny cartoon where Pepe Le Pew walked by and then all the clocks melted, right? So it's just sort of been in our popular culture for a while. And people bring it up like, oh, this is surreal, when basically they just mean this isn't supposed to be happening. Well, the surreal tenet in a novel or in a work of art, but I'm just going to say novel or short story, is that, of course, this is happening. Why wouldn't there be to talk about Betina's wonderful book? Why wouldn't there be a bunch of deers attacking in the middle of the, I mean, it just seems right. It's weird for us to have a problem with that. They've got horns. We look vulnerable. It would just happen like that. So I think that's closer to my sort of working definition about it.
Yeah, fatalism. I love that. I mean, I love that. So I'm just keeping note. Surprise plus fatalism, I think, is an interesting way to look at it. I think one of my further questions was like, what can surrealism do either better or differently than other forms toward a certain purpose? We often hear from, about sci-fi, that some of the best sci-fi, think of Ursula K. Le Guin, for instance, is, highlighting, it may be in a fantastical world, light years and light years away, but it's really highlighting things that make sense to us. And for sure, it's shining a mirror on us, class differences, economic differences, xenophobia, racism, all of that. And so I think that in a ways that as well. And I guess like when I think of surrealism, and especially when I look at the definition in Merriam-Webster, which is fine, but I just think that surrealism kind of has this, it's defined as like a dreamlike quality, but which is true, but in the same way, it gets to realism. It gets to truth, in a different way than maybe realist fiction does, but through a different avenue.
It has to. It has to get there, or it won't be able to be palatable. Surrealism already is kind of like asking too much. And unless put it this way, I think it has much more to do with epiphanic writing, like a la James Joyce, than it does with anybody like just trying to show you a shocking thing that you might. I mean, Bret Easton Ellis is not surreal. Doesn't matter what's going on in American Psycho. It's like satire. It's like it might, parts of it are even like closer to, parts of it are probably even closer to like George Eliot than it's just not surreal. But the same elements you can find in a Harlan Ellison story if he's not trying to be too cool, and you would just say, well, that's closer to surrealism. He's just getting to the only way he can describe something in deep fact metaphor with no argument. Just give you the metaphor, and that's kind of it. So I would say, what can it do better? Well, it has to totally describe the mood. It has to get to the mood in a way that there's no question that this was it. This comes close to the fatalism part of what I was saying. It has to be like, so that's it. We saw it, and people can't try to make their work. I think Pynchon was asked about it one time, and he was bringing up, well, he never gets interviewed, right? But he brought it up like in an essay that it couldn't just be like a weird instrument. Maybe, I guess he was talking about that Borga guy that would play instruments, make music. It has to be like on a right note. It has to be the right note with that instrument. You can't just be funny. It can't just be like say it's going to be like, I got 2 random cologne bottles, since you guys can all like smell me over there, right? So they're random, right? Whatever. But this one works for some reason. This one, all of a sudden, I feel like this wouldn't work for a, so it has to just fit immediately. And I guess it's not allowing for an argument is really the whole thing. And if you're cool with that when you're reading it, you'll be able to. But almost no surrealist writing is pumped by like plot devices. It's always sort of epiphanic. That's why you find so many pieces of paper that someone finds, like, and I picked it up and it said, and then it's like a clue. Like Rob Gray will do that. Like you'll pick up clues and you'll go from clue to clue, possibly get nowhere, but make a real circle. But it's basically about picking up the clues. Think that was kind of a roundabout way of talking about a circle, but
Well, there's no other way to talk about a circle than roundabout, for sure. No, like your colognes remind me. Is it Laffy in the final story? The blue room smells of different colognes. So it reminds me of that a bit. I love how you mentioned Tex Avery. And I'm just divining, some of your own kind of hobbies and interests that suffuse the stories as well. I mean, there's other cartoons. There's Betty Boop. There's Felix the Cat that come up in the stories as well.
Yeah. Taking for granted, like sort of dreams. Can you hear me? I guess it kind of froze up there. I'll just go ahead and talk. Taking for granted sort of the working theory about what dreams do, which is basically take in a lot of information, and at that point, you sort of codify it, and you have yourself a language for whatever the events of the day were. Taking that for granted, I do treat almost all fiction in a way as if we're just going to be talking about comic books, commercials, radio, and such. So I don't see Matt here, but I guess other people are around, so I'm just going to talk for a bit. Oh, I know what. What does it do? What does Surrealism do? Okay. Earlier today, when I was waiting around for this thing to open up, I started just drawing, right, without thinking. So I kind of drew like that stuff. I guess it was like a 10-minute thing. I think the guy's underwater. I'm not sure. What I can tell that it does mostly for the writing part of it is that it organizes your anxiety, or it lends art to whatever phase you think needs to be. Oh, I guess I'm getting questions. Whatever phase needs to be dealt with in a way that you can, I guess, freely translate without any kind of worry. Hi, Lily. Can you hear me?
Hi. Hi, I just wanted to join you while we're waiting for Matt to get back in.
Okay, well, cool. Thanks, Lily.
Of course. I remember that you mentioned that you wanted to share some stories. I mean, some pictures.
Oh, well, that was kind of a joke. I think I did just share one, though. I don't know if it came out. I drew this when I was waiting to get on. That was 10 minutes ago, right? I don't think it's great or anything, but what Matt was asking, right, was like, what Matt was asking kind of like what the function of, like, well, the function for this was basically I was nervous, and I started drawing, right? So much of surrealist writing comes out of a direct nervousness with the state. I mean, if you think about what surrealism was when it approached like a mass consciousness, it was after the war, and people were even protesting with suicide as part of this surrealism. So most of it is like just trying to take in and deal. So like I said a little while ago, I don't think there's any room for argument within it. You're not supposed to say, well, is this good, or is this, it's just supposed to be, no, this is what it is. There's a manner of fatalism going on in like in appreciating it or finding it repulsive. It's always going to be kind of just, well, I don't think I can change this. I mean, how do you change a bad thought that you had? Hopefully dementia at some point, or death, and that's it. So other than that, you're just going to have to remember it. But so there's some questions that people have typed in.
Yeah.
Am I supposed to read those? Okay.
I really want to get to the question Robin submitted, because you and I were chatting backstage how we're both Valley people, and so I'm really interested in knowing how the Valley has influenced and enriched your stories and the concept of surrealism, because it's the Valley.
Yeah, well, the Valley, you got out, right? And I did for a little while, and I'm back here right now. I don't say that I'm back in, but it's one of these things that I don't know if we can deal with it the way that it changed so radically, for one thing. When I was a kid, it seems like it could have been that way for like 10, 20, 30 years, right? And all of a sudden it changed. So things that you were used to, like your phone number switched over to a cell phone, that's how the landscape kind of became too. Places that you depended on forever. Like we now have a library here that is built out of in McAllen, it's built out of an old Walmart, right? So the library is built out of a Walmart. Hey, that's like a Baudrillard thing or something, right? And we have that here now. the old library became an art center where I went over there maybe about 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. However long ago, I was with a childhood friend. I walked in there, and there was now a church service going on in the old library. And I mean, walk in there looking like a couple of witches or something on a Sunday, and there's a church service. It already looks surreal. The Valley definitely influenced my literary tastes in that the Ropa Usadas, where I would buy books, had like, I mean, I think I got my first William Burroughs novel, Junkie, there when I was like 17 for a quarter, right? So you could like read that stuff that everybody donated from New York in a big burlap sack, and, you know, get yourself a nice funky coat, and then, like, you know, just act like some like bohemian, walk around the dead malls, and, you know, far they had that dead mall.
Yeah. There's always like there's always a little bit of explaining the Valley to someone who, you know, has never heard of what border life might be like. There is this element of what that's literally your life. Like, all of the storefronts are in Spanish. So I'm curious, like, how much that might have influenced.
I think it influenced it like massively, and I'm only now kind of coming to terms with it. Like okay, so I remember I used to go to Mexico. Believe it or not, and nobody believes this probably, but I never drank until I was legally 21, right? But you could drink. Everybody just went to Mexico, right? So all my friends or people that I knew, whatever, they would just be like, let's go to Mexico. You want to go to Mexico? Okay, so they all go to Arturo's. But I'm not talking about like for a party. I mean, like, oh, math was kind of tough today. It's 4 o'clock. We're gonna go to Arturo's and have a couple of cocktails. It was like that, you know. And a little bit before that, I'd have friends that were like skateboarding, and they'd be like, well, let's go skateboard in Reynosa. Why are we here? They got nice places to see. So just take a bus, go to Mexico, skateboard in Reynosa, come back in time for the Cosby Show, you know. So that's the Valley, you know. That's what that was, and it was pretty. It was. I mean, it was. I don't know. I really don't know how I feel about it, except for just like you always wanted to leave, and I think it's because it took so damn long to get out. Like, it took forever to get to past like the checkpoint, even, you know, where they just let you through for some reason, you know, without, you know.
That's Texas too, right? No, but I was actually talking about that. And Matt, I'm going to leave. Now it's just become me and Roberto talking about the Valley. But I was talking about that with Sandra Cisneros, because she was saying that, you know, when you're growing up in places like the Valley, or the way that she felt about Chicago, you know, you almost have to leave so that you can come to terms with the place that you're from.
The thing is, like, you could come, like, now I'm here right now, and I keep telling myself I don't live here, right? Because I don't need to live. Yeah, and the thing is, it's like, I don't know why I don't want to live here anymore. It's not the same place, you know, and it's completely, nothing's the same. It's completely different, but I do feel like it's not my place anymore. Like, I don't feel. I don't know. Even that Oscar Cazares guy, he wrote that book.
Yeah.
Right? He wrote some article one time about, and I can't even believe this thing got published, man. He wrote this thing about, like, in the Texas Monthly, and it was just like, he's like, I don't think I want to go back there anymore. People are too slow. He just wrote that down, and I was like, dude, you know, it just sounded really wild. But like,
well, Domingo Martinez too. He comes hard for the Valley too.
Okay, now if I'm gonna champion any writer right now that's going to talk about the Valley, I'm going to say that guy, Domingo Martinez. That book, I was the biggest. Actually, it's funny when you look at that book. You got like 5 quotes from different magazines that are all me. You know, I was like the biggest champion of that thing when I read that. I had never seen anybody really talk about the Valley the way he did it. It was just straight up. Sometimes, like, I'm no good or bad to anybody, but sometimes people write about the Valley and they definitely cartoon it up. Like, they just put a lot of stuff in there that isn't. Like, okay, so my short story, not to get back into I really don't want it to go back into my short story, They Let Me Drive, that's like McAllen and Farr, because I was a delivery driver when I kind of was around there, or I started doing that. Actually, I was doing something else, but I got into that. But that's kind of what that experience looks like. And some kid I heard was reading that, and they were like, I hate this story because it's just right where I'm from, man, I know it. And they knew it was the Valley, reading that story from the descriptions of the almost yellow, almost white house or whatever, and like sort of the poverty, the movable poverty that you can kind of sense everywhere.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I definitely think, okay, so to me, the Valley is this, like, when I was a kid, you had HBO, you were rich, right? So, like, and I remember, like, that's the Valley to me, man. And I remember, like, having an Atari set because I don't know, my dad was nice, right? But I hate video games. So a bunch of kids would come over and play them. And I had to like pretend they were all my friends or something like that. That's the Valley, like a bunch of technology that lets you feel like you're not where you are. Because if you just
Yeah.
look outside, it's flat and hot and crazy. And everybody, I mean, if I was going to run for mayor of McAllen, I always tell people this. I'd say, okay, so my platform would be like, let's get rid of palm trees. They just take all the water, and they don't protect you from this. It's so hot, right? And they don't protect you from anything. And let's try to like do something about all these cops. We don't need them. Those would be my two like things that So I wouldn't win or anything, but that's what the Valley is: a bunch of cops running around getting breakfast and palm trees. So or that's what I've noticed so far.
Oh, we're going to tag team Matt back in here into this conversation. So
me and Lily are just sort of talking about the Valley now. Thanks, Lily. I really thank you for making me feel at home though.
Hi again. Not sure what happened there. It may have been me. But yeah, no, I mean, you mentioned Atari. I remember I grew up in the suburbs of Houston, and I would go over the border to drink too before I was 21, but I remember my Atari very fondly. I wouldn't say I was a huge video game guy either, but I did like them when I was young, for sure. But forgive me, Roberto, I'm not sure exactly where we left off, but I do have another question for you, and it's a topic that it's a term that comes up in comic books, which is, you may not like video games, but I imagine you do like comics, or maybe did at one point in your life. And the Silver Age of comic books is a distinct era, but of course the Silver Age means other things as well, historically. And typically it defines a kind of disillusionment, maybe a bit of cynicism, a symbology of a once great time, a time symbolized by grandeur, but doesn't exist anymore, and so on. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about, and I got the sense that there was this Silver Age kind of atmosphere to a lot of the stories, and I hope that I hope I've described it well enough to kind of like run with it. But could you talk a little bit about?
I think that's
mindset
that's
and
really that's a real accurate thing that you pointed out. For one thing, that whatever the grandeur or like the golden age in Hollywood or in comic books, it's not that it's any good. It's that it's there, and kind of like whatever it is as intense as it is, as ugly as it is, or as garish and maybe sexy or like really offensive, it gets kind of mannered up in the Silver Age time, right? And that's what that is a lot of reflection. No weirdo pun there for the reflection in the silver and the mirror and all that, but it's definitely what's going on. Is people are starting to feel kind of like, what have we done? And it is sort of a reflective state. And I think that most of my stories, and I don't know if I'm ever going to get around this, are a bunch of people going like, what have I done? Or what am I doing right now? Like, why am I doing this? And what does it mean? That's definitely a motif that's going on. But yeah, you're right about that. Whenever you notice something, whenever like an estate maybe notices that they really enjoy something, there's something strange about that, because that they have to rationalize so much of it. They've got to cut off all that made it dangerous. They get rid of everything that made it offensive, racist, strange, dangerous in a way that like maybe incommensurable with their lives, all the pre-code stuff. And now, okay, well, let's see how I can work this into my life as a hobby. So it becomes a lifestyle. So there's something kind of fetishistic about it even. So all in all, in a way, it is a taming situation, and it's almost kind of like a burden, like the burden of manners or something, a civilizing aspect of something. Like if you ever really want to freak out, you watch these old like whatever Mickey Mouse's competition was for a while. I forget the other animal. Those are some dark cartoons. They're really upsetting, and I don't think I would show them to a kid or really even to some adults, because they're just too strange in a way. There's no context for enjoying them. And I think that the kind of Silver Age reflectiveness, which I guess if we're all lucky enough to even be middle-aged, it's basically about like figuring out, okay, well, that worked, and why was it lovely? Have I learned anything? Do I want to live, with this? And those are the little questions that are really entire. How am I going to work this into my? How do I look myself in the mirror? A lot of us don't. When you get into a hobby, you don't, especially because you sort of take over a role. That's another big motif of mine, is people pretending that there's someone that they're not, like in that what's that story, that one about the fake real estate girl in there? You know, maybe she's pretending she's selling a house that she doesn't own. Or even the fellow who's sending the postcards to himself is sort of pretending that somebody's sending them to himself, like he's got some kind of concern when really it's him trying to start new. A lot of lying, you know, a lot of sort of the aesthetics of lying. I sort of think it's impossible to lie to yourself. I mean, if you really pulled it off, then it's not a lie, you know, you really believe it. And, you know, other than that, you kind of know what's going on. A lot of these characters, maybe they're sort of in that liminal place where they're trying to figure that out. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting observation about that. It's definitely about reflecting. In fact, I think I write almost exclusively about people trying to figure out how much energy they spent into something. Like I have papers that I've collected since I was like a little kid, and every once in a while I just pull them out and I look at them just to think about like what I was thinking about when I was doing that. And it's definitely almost like a life project to do that. And we're sort of luxurious in that way, in this sort of, I don't know, this sort of like it's not a garbage culture, I wouldn't call it, but it is a collector culture. You know, people sort of collect things to identify with. And I think that's something that it's definitely a motif that I've got going with everything. I mean, the news stories that I'm writing, 45% of them are like fake TV shows based on real shows. I've got a lot of fake Three's Company episodes going on in my news stories, so which is basically about watching reruns, you know.
I love that. I'm looking forward to those shows because I've binged on Three's Company, you know, many times, for sure. I love what you said about a liminal space, because that's kind of like what I was gathering too. There was an author at Texas Book Festival last November who also described, you know, generally you and Lily were talking about RGV earlier, and described kind of like RGV as sort of a liminal space in lots of ways too. So I find that kind of interesting. So I wanted to talk about, you mentioned hobbies too, and we've talked about this a bit, but, you know, the postcards, you know, comics, you know, this sort of thing. How have your own hobbies kind of inserted themselves into some of these stories and their characters?
I always say, like, I kind of don't have hobbies, and I think that's a lie, but it might have something more to do with the fact that I've integrated them so much into whatever my program is. The other thing, I just don't let them stop. Like okay, so like when I write, I almost never, this is kind of how my handwriting is, right? It's just like that, right? When I write, I don't think of it as any different from drawing. So I'm working on a new story right now, right? So it'll look like that a little bit, you know? It'll just look kind of like that. And it'll cut into that kind of thing. Oh, thank God Bettina's here. And so I think of integration as the main thing that's going on in general. Like I'll wake up and I remember maybe 45% of a dream, and so that's definitely going to be the reason why I'll pick up whatever book I'm reading. And if there is no stopping point there, it's basically going to be a situation where I'm going to make it all meet out, right? So hobbies, yeah, okay, but every hobby, yeah, rock collecting. I used to like music. Now I don't know if I do. I think I was really into watching people talk on mute when I was a kid. You know, that was like a hobby. Like I would watch or changing the color on the TV. I'd watch Moonlighting and change it really red and see how Bruce Willis looked, and like all red. You know, and that was like a hobby of mine. I guess it was Fauvist or something. But anyway, that's yeah.
Thank you. Hi, Betina. Welcome.
Hi, Matt.
And for the audience members out there, you know, please do go ahead and continue to put your questions in the Q&A. I mean, we don't have a ton of time left, but we would love to get to as many questions as we can. Roberto, if you don't mind, I'll move almost exclusively to Betina now, just for the moment, so we could chat a bit.
Yeah, I was going to insist, you know.
Yeah, but Roberto and I and Lily at SABF who has, you know, graciously jumped on when, you know, some connection went out and we had a technical difficulty of ourselves, have been talking a bit about Betina, you know, some of the topics that I sent to you earlier as well. But I guess maybe I'll just start too, and then I'll move to a question that I had for the two of you as well. But Roberto and I were talking about how the event of 9/11, which is shockingly 20 years ago this year, if you can believe it, suffused so many of his own stories, whether it was mentioned explicitly or not. And I know in an author's note that you mentioned that there.
Betina, can you hear?
No, I lost Matt completely.
Oh, okay. Well, you know what? Until he comes back, can I ask you a question?
Yes, of course.
I'm really enjoying your novel, and one of the things that struck me as very interesting is your use of classification as sort of a technique. You have the zoo, and you have the museum, and you have the characters sort of with conditions, and everybody's sort of bracketed as far as age. To me, it kind of reminded me of semiotics a little bit. I don't know how influenced you are by that, but it did remind me a little bit of semiotics, and I was sort of excited to see that, because that kind of progression would be just from tableau vivant to tableau vivant, like if you're reading Roland Barthes or something. And it's exciting just to see the observations, So I was wondering if you could talk about that a little.
It's interesting that you mentioned this, because I haven't thought a lot about that. I used to teach semiotics, so there's something there. So obviously it's in my brain, right? But I think the way I thought about it in the novel is because I have always been interested in science, right? Science as a discourse, science as a way of trying to, make sense of the world. And it's what we do, similar to what we do as fiction writers, right? With different devices, but scientists and writers, we are working on this material, right? This raw material that is the reality and is the world. And so I have always been fascinated by the connections between science and fiction. Not specifically science fiction as a genre, although I read a lot of that, but science as a place where you find amazing stories, right? Amazing ways of trying to make sense of the world. So there is that idea of a taxonomy, as you mentioned, right? Classification of the world. And also, I think when you are interested in something, you start to question it, right? So in the novel, the science is a little bit off, right? There is this idea of taxidermia and museums, for me, as places of the past, right? The past science, the colonial science, the 19th century science that sought to appropriate other cultures and start to appropriate the nature as a subject, right? So I think those themes are in the novel, you're right. And also, there is the zoo, and also the plant shop, right? The idea of trying to create, this woman trying to, to make this seed work, and to get the albaria and try to see what happens with the flower and the way it affects your brain. So there is a lot of science in the novel, but it is somehow a distorted science.
Well, it definitely comes off. And when I was reading it, when I first got the copy a little while ago, I was asking myself what it reminded me of, and it reminded me of Aristotle's De Anima, is what it reminded me of. And I just kind of was wondering why, and I thought it's got to be because of the classification, but also there are these asides of mystery in Aristotle where he's like, well, we don't have to talk about that right now. The guy will just say, right, and then he'll go into talking about something. Well, we don't have to talk about
that point.
Right. And it's fascinating. It's almost a literary technique, and so I thought, oh yeah, this is definitely informed by that. I'm glad that. I'm glad I asked though that, because I didn't know you taught semiotics. And how do you think that's informed your?
I wasn't aware that I wasn't aware of that influence as a, but of course, everything you do as a writer influences you. Any job you have, any life experience you had. So for a while, I taught semiotics at the university because I teach at Buenos Aires. I teach to students that are going to be journalists, and they have to take semiotics. And now I teach writing, but for a while I work as a semiotics teacher. But everything was applied to the media, right? We were talking. It was a very theoretical course, but we tried to analyze TV, radio, and social media, and from that point, from that frame, the semiotic.
I'm glad that you can illustrate that gets taught for a purpose, like for journalism, right? Because I think well, what I'm used to is whenever people taught it is mostly for careerism, like they were teaching it so they can maybe teach it. So that's a little different.
Yeah, no point.
I like to know that it's being practically used. So that's fascinating. The other thing about your book that I really enjoyed, and I was going to ask you about, okay, so you made a joke a while ago about not wanting to talk about magic realism, right? And I don't want to talk about it either. But
we can talk about it.
What about Cortázar, though? That's the thing. Some of your writing.
Cortázar was never.
No, he wasn't.
Cool, right? Yeah.
Right, but something about his something about Cortázar. He has this story. I don't even remember the name of the story. It's like one in the '80s where people are kind of like living in a subway. And the language that's being used is really sort of reminiscent of what you're doing too. And I was wondering about the influence of the boom in general to your writing.
Well, for me, the boom was huge because I was very young when these writers were famous. So I read 100 Years of Solitude when I was 15, and I read Cortázar's short stories when I was probably that age. So I didn't have a conflict with them. That happened to the other generation, to the older generation, right? And not to my generation. So I enjoy them, and of course, that's also an influence, right? Anything that you read when you are so young, it goes to your writing, it goes to your way of thinking, and I think well, everybody abjurates from Cortázar. When we get older, we realize that when what he did in the short stories, that he had a model, right? A very precise idea of the fantastic, what we call fantastico rioplatense, right? And he worked with that. He worked with the way he constructed his stories was always in two levels, two worlds that were permeating each other, and at the end, there was that surprise that it felt almost like some ways almost like a mechanical device, right? And I guess my generation reacted towards that, that idea, that perfect mechanism of the fantastic. So it is an influence for sure, but we try to do something different. So I wouldn't say I write fantastic fiction, but it's for sure not realistic, right? So I like to work with it. I like to work with the genres, right?
You quoted Jean Baudrillard's America, and that book. I wrote about that book a little while ago, and one of the things that I saw when I came back to it were he also kind of talks about amusement park situations, in sort of like the hyper situation going on. And you bring up something like that in your book when you're talking about I would say like the way the museums are sort of preserving like the, I guess like the caveman days, or the way you have like the dinosaur thing going on. I guess it seems like an aesthetic. Are you particularly fond of that kind of metaphor? You know, like sort of the museum.
Well, I must say that I read your article about Baudrillard's book.
Okay. Thank you.
And I love the part where you talk about the desert, you know, because that's I think he hits the point there. It's a very short book, and it's not one of the Baudrillard's hardcore philosophical works, right? It's supposed to be a travel book.
It's a travel log, yeah.
Yeah, and I think he only got some impressions, some ideas of America. You know, I live in America for 10 years, so I can see how superficial that is. But that said, he has very clever points, right? The amusement park is one of them. If you think about America in the world, in the map of the world, I will say, well, we consume a lot of products, cultural products that come from America, and it's our amusement park. And, you know, with cultural things that we for sure, but we're there consuming them. There's a whole part of your life as a spectator or as a reader that happens in the world that is created by Americans and by the American industry, right? So what I thought is interesting about Baudrillard is that he takes that idea of the amusement parks, but he didn't he doesn't with that. And I was thinking, well, in a novel, as a writer, we can appropriate from that culture. We already live in that culture. Why shouldn't you write about that? And one thing I like, one of your short stories that you write about comics a lot, right? And one of your short stories, The Fight for the Face, is about heroes and comics and superheroes. And you're right there writing about the cultural industry that is that big amusement park and this mass media culture. And you are rewriting the idea of the hero in that short story, right? Also about it, there's a lot of to say about that story about masculinity and the kind of hero that industry sells you, right? And I think as writers we do that. We take things from the industry and we appropriate them and we write different things, and it's a way of questioning reality.
Oh, thank you. That's a great. I'm glad that you mentioned that. It'll make me think about it in a deeper way. I think. I was wondering, you teach creative writing, and I'm wondering how you would try to. When you have a student come up to you who's just read your book and wants to figure out kind of like how to do that kind of thing, it's a difficult thing to try to propose that they need to be coming into the culture, almost looking at it from outside when they're here. I mean, what kind of advice would you give a student that wanted to write like sort of a satirical, absurdist book that looks like the world? When they're wanting to do that, it's kind of it seems to me as if anybody reading your book would want to know what it took to be that brave, to just be writing about the world around you like that,
Well, it took 10 years of suffering. Not only because it was a hard novel to write, but also because some years I spent as a graduate student were not the happiest years of my life. The US is a hard place to be a foreigner, right? An immigrant. So it takes a lot of life experience, right? And then a lot of guts to take a foreign culture and do that. And, I was second guessing myself the whole time. I wasn't sure I was going to find an editor. And you can't write thinking that you want to sell your book. You had to write it from the guts. You had to write it because you need it. And the way I did it, as you know, very soon in the novel, I realized I wasn't going to write a realistic novel. There was no point on doing that, because you have amazing realistic writers doing that right now in the US. I had to do something different, coming from another culture. So I did something that I call a Latin Americanization of the US, looking into the, you know, the weak points, or what I thought were the weak points in that empire, and maybe exaggerate them. And that took me to a completely fictional world of my own, right? So that's why I created a city, and I decided it was going to be a complete fictional city with complete fictional characters that will give me the freedom to do that, right? But I'm not sure I answered your question, but it was a very good question.
You gave me more than I needed. Actually, I'm glad that you brought that up. It almost brings up the Borges simulacrum thing when you talked about the fictional. Right. Thank you.
Well, he's a huge influence. You know, we are lucky as Latin Americans, but especially as Argentinians, to have Borges in our past, because he was a very brave writer, right? Yeah, he took British literature, American literature, French literature, and he did whatever he wanted with that. And I think we have to, you know, live up to that legacy. And it is so fun, you know, when you read Borges. And he was such a free writer. He felt he was, you know, chatting with Shakespeare and the Greeks and everybody. And you know, he respected them, but also he thought he was one of them. And I think that's a good example. Of course, we are not Borges. We would like to be Borges, you know, and have that.
We're not Borges, right? But you know, it's weird. When I was younger, I was really hung up about like, oh, I can't, right? Then I read him a while ago, and I thought, you know what? I don't think he had this attitude when he was working on this stuff. And so much of what he brings up is almost like towards the end, especially a lot of self-parody, like to make you think about that. You know, he'll say, look, H.G. Wells is way better than Proust, right? So why are you reading Proust? Read H.G. Wells, right? And you're like, oh, I can do that. So you get into that a little bit, you know, read Edgar Allan Poe, read H.G. Wells, and at the same time, maybe you study the Kabbalah, I guess, and then you'll end up, you know, kind of nowhere more.
Right.
It seemed accessible, you know.
Yeah, it is. He was, and of course he also. If you read recently, we had a book here published. It was a book by Adolfo Bioy Casares, his friends.
I was going to bring him up.
Every conversation,
yeah.
Right, and this is an amazing book to actually know how Borges thought, and he was not so paid. He was not pretentious, right? You can think he was, but he himself, you know, and he didn't take anything for granted, not even Shakespeare. No,
he wasn't pretentious, and he with that guy Casares, Boyes Casares, the first thing they ever wrote together was a yogurt like advertisement.
Right.
So they're not worried about not commercializing, you know. So,
and they had so much book, fun.
That book. What's the name of that? It's Robin Bissett here has asked to name a surrealist book or something to read, and that one by Boyes Casares is the one. What's the name of that thing again? It's the island of, not the island of, it's the...
yes, it's called, in Spanish, it's La Invención de Morel. And I think it got translated with a different title, like The Strange Island or something like that. Right. It's an island, it's a very good novel.
And it became that movie, actually Lost, apparently that show Lost is based on the movie by Rob Gray that was based on that, Nearbound or whatever, or something like that. And I mean, that's a great book. That's a great book. If anybody was curious about surreal type writing, that isn't really surreal.
I'm gonna try his name here.
Cool. That's the
author.
I would recommend anybody read that book.
Well, fact, you guys have given us You guys have given us so much of your time generously. We have gone over by 5 minutes. So I just want to be mindful of everyone's time. There, she put it in the Adolfo Cázares, La Invención de Morel. She put it in the chat. But thank you, Roberto. What a champ. My God, we're going to send you a San Antonio Book Festival care package for your patience with all the tech issues today. Betina, I'm sorry you joined us so late, but I hope that, you know, I could listen to you all talk for a very long time. Thank you, everybody. Please buy their books from Nowhere Bookshop, our official bookseller, and enjoy the rest of the festival tomorrow. Thank you, Roberto. Thank you, Bettina.
Yeah, I'm sorry the link wasn't working and I joined up late, but it was amazing to talk to you, Roberto. Thank you.
You know, and Lily, God, hey, I started my day listening to you, and I think I'm going to end it now listening to you. That's right. The bookend right there. If you want to send anything to me, send me a picture of that guy that fell in the pool that you mentioned earlier.
That fell in the fountain. Yeah, this was after he'd asked.
I'll take it.
All right, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.